do something a little bit different. A couple of years ago, I had self-published a book under a different name. It didn't do very well, but I think that has more to do with my lack of knowledge in the publishing world. But now that I have my new microphone and camera set up, I thought this might be a good opportunity to try doing a version with audio. This is an old copy of the book. It's a science fiction novel. If anybody is interested, I'll include a link down below. It's on the Amazon Kindle. You can also order the paperback. The cover has since changed. I redesigned that in November of 2014, so the cover doesn't look like this anymore. But it was called Beyond Bermuda, Evil Within the Rift, and I published it under the name Ashley Hornbaker. Again, the link will be underneath if you care to support a struggling artist slash amateur writer. But anyways, being kind of a nerd growing up, one of the things that I really found comfort in was the sound of pages flipping. It has its own ASMR to it in some respects, and well, this book doesn't smell, but you know how old books or books that have been on someone's shelves are handled a lot. They have a unique feel to them, unique smell to them even. So I was thinking maybe I could share this with you, and if it sounds like something that you're interested in, the book is available in a e-reader format and also a traditional paperback. And you'd be supporting an independent author. I would greatly appreciate that. But if not, I do also have to advise that this book has a lot of adult language. It does not contain any sexual content, but I did get a bit of a potty mouth with it. It's a science fiction novel. The premises is about a man who gets lost in the Bermuda Triangle, and he resurfaces to find himself in a laboratory. He has very little recollection of what happened to him, and his captors explain to him that he's been missing for 26 years, but his medical records and his physical health show he hasn't aged at all. So it's kind of a play off of the Bermuda Triangle and some of the common myths and mysteries that revolve around that. So anywho, let's start with Prelude. Hell's feet sank into the marshland with every exhausting step. The land surrounding him was barren and dead as the lifeless trees hung low, their branches dipping into the soil and the cold, murky fog lingering just above the ground. There was no wind, and the only sound came from the mud as his feet penetrated its surface. The thick fog clung to his skin as he passed through, paddling his arms as if he could push it out of the way. The dense moisture settled on his skin, leaving an unusual residue that trailed down his arms and bare chest with gray streaks. It was calm now, as he cautiously peered through the green haze, but he knew that could change at any moment. He glanced down at his watch and smeared away the film that covered the glass. The arms stood still, as did the compass, which he'd grown accustomed to after so many days, yet he still held out hope that some sort of normalcy or measurement would start ticking away again. The sky was dim and gray, giving an omnipresent gloom over the land that never seemed to change. There were no significant landmarks or objects that stood out among the rest, just a never-ending marshland in an ever-present time. There were no day or night cycles either, and without a functional clock, he could only guess how long he'd been lost. Forward, just move forward, he told himself. He felt the jolt as time began to shift. It was an odd sensation, one he would very much describe like a punch to the head. There was a twist, almost painful as the feeling slammed into his body. Then there was the slow motion as he absorbed the shock, temporarily forgetting the unusual sensation. Lastly, the recoil, as his mind snapped back, the pain of the impact and the struggle to find his center of gravity again. Hal felt as the shift began, and he crouched down, gripping his knees as he waited for the push. Time slowed, and he breathed in, closing his eyes as the bright flare of light sparked. It was an unexplainable phenomenon that had been happening every couple of hours. He wasn't even sure if it was real or if it was psychological, but for several days it'd been occurring more consistently. After a dozen or so times, he'd learned to recognize the signs and brace himself for the shift. All movement seemed to pause, and the first spark of green light appeared, flickering ever so briefly. He frantically looked to his side, trying to catch a glimpse of it, but it vanished too soon. The chaos was about to begin. The second phase slowly faded in as the lone horn began to resonate over the land, echoing off the trees from every direction. The peaceful land that stood still below him was now awakening as the roots began to stir and writhe through the soil. He steadied his footing and squinted, trying to see through the green haze. The horn itself was a mystery. It came from no particular direction, but he'd witnessed it too many times to ignore it. The needles of his watch began to spin frantically on its axis, and the horn steadied its loud, steady pitch. It was a wake-up call. The earth had found its prey and was calling out to the demons that resided. It was also an alarm for the transition. Panic arose in his chest as his feet instinctively sprinted forward. The second burst of light flashed, sparked to his left, and he flinched. His vision faded with the flicker, and he slowed to orient himself. Vines wiggled through the soil, and the branches that soaked and penetrated it were now heaving out of place. Like a bright camera flash, Hal squinted his eyes and waited for the blinding glow to fade. He slowed his pace, but he didn't dare stop as he cautiously stepped forward. A lashing pain struck his side, and he stumbled. He gripped his bicep, feeling the warm trail of blood as it traveled down his arm to his fingertips. The panic paused, and his feet halted as he watched the droplet fall, flowing through the air before colliding to the ground and instantly shattering that moment into chaos. The mother beast wailed, and the ground trembled with her shriek. The shock waves startled the surroundings as the branches heaved and retreated. The vines below grew stiff under his feet. She was alerted. "Run," Hal whispered to himself, dodging forward without a second thought. The marsh came alive more than ever now, whipping its branches as they searched for its prey. The soil gave with every step, stirring below as the roots gripped for his bare feet and pulling him farther. The blinding flash sparked again before him, dulling his senses. His pulse was deafening in his ears as he swung his arms for balance before falling. He slid on his back as the cold soil slithered over his skin, covering his arms and chest. With his limbs slowly growing immobile, he steadied his breath as his vision faded back. The fog settled, no longer rushing behind in his wake. His body quickly grew cold as it was covered in the mud. He lay still, listening as the footsteps came closer. A disfigured foot slowly peered through the fog and then paused. Although he'd heard the shrieks before, he'd never seen her this close. He held his breath and he remained still as he gazed forward. The beast took another step, piercing through the green haze and becoming fully visible. Her structure was almost human-like, but horridly mutated. She balanced on two main legs that extended forward. The feet were more like claws, sinking and gripping into the soil as they pierced through. A third leg had protruded out the back with an inverted knee. Its foot was flat, used to steady the large mass directly above. She walked more like a crab as her spinal cord bent forward at the pelvis, extending upward to the sunken stomach cavity. Large bones stretched the milky white skin of her enlarged chest, and what looked like breasts drooped to the sides. Bulging collarbones led to the massive shoulders, and her long arms fell downward, touching the ground. Her hands were claws, curled into long fists with 2 fingers and a thumb as she pummeled the ground as she ran. She took another step forward, sniffing the air, and Hal's eyes gravitated forwards. Black veins could be seen through her white, thin skin rising up her chest to her neck. Bulbs were growing on the surface, and they throbbed with her pulse. She balanced awkwardly on her limbs, shifting back and forth as she tried to pinpoint her prey. Her nose had decayed, leaving the 2 small holes where the nasal cavity would have been. A protruding brow overshadowed the sunken dark holes of her eyes below, but Hal could see the large black bulbs as they darted back and forth. The skin on her face was torn with open gashes and exposed the dark fluid underneath. Patches of bone stuck out from her jawbone and chin, which had mutated into large calcified surfaces. She paused only 10 feet away, and the fog fell still. She was nearly within arm's reach, and yet didn't seem to be aware he was even there. The soil beneath him, however, continued to move, and its grip tightened. The echo of the horn stopped, and there was a sudden jolt. It seemed as if time itself had halted. He let out a huge exhale of relief when the transition occurred, and the creature began to freeze in place. Everything slowly stopped. The beast now looked like a milky white body hovering in time, completely motionless and still. The sunken eyes had a hollow white glaze over the dark spheres, but remained in place, no longer searching for a target. The grip of the soil also froze, and finally allowed for him to break free. Pulling his arm from its grasp, he gazed at his watch, which had now stopped at the frantic spinning. His body was torn, and a deep cut above his eye blurred his vision even more, but its warmth was almost comforting as the stream slid down his cheek. For the time being, it was a little reminder that he was still alive and able to move. Pulling his other limbs from the veins of the soil, he sat up and tried to orient himself. Breathing was now calm, and he stared at the unbelievable creature as it remained paused in time. No one had ever come this close for an encounter, but he'd heard the groans and wailing from an unseen distance. He'd never believed she really existed, or at least not quite in this form. Another blinding flash appeared, and he flinched, holding an arm to cover his eyes, but the light remained. It was no longer just a spark. He strained as his irises accepted the whiteout. His hearing perked, and he faintly heard the sound of a man's voice somewhere in the distance. The words were muffled, but calm, and Hal focused as he tried to make out the words. "Hal Brent, can you hear me? Mr. Brent." The echoes quieted as his vision came back. The brightness faded, and Hal's hearing fell mute again. The flash came and went, and as before it lingered. The voices also returned, quietly at first, and then coherently close. "Hello?" Hal spoke, but unable to hear his own voice. Can anyone hear me?" "Get the oxygen. His lungs are strained," the man's voice came in again. The feeling of chaos and movement brushed against his skin. He could feel the hands touching his chest and the warmth that came from them. His sensations were fading in and out. One moment the man was close, even touching him, and then another moment everything fell numb. The light disappeared, and his vision slowly focused on the surrounding trees and brush of the swampy land. He leaned forward, putting his hands on his knees for support as his head continued to spin. Was this a new transition? He breathed heavy, again trying to focus on that brief moment of contact, but it didn't come again. Several moments had passed, and the world around him became reality more and more. Was it a hallucination? Was it something new in this bizarre, hellish nightmare he couldn't wake from? He swallowed in protest as he accepted the reality of the cold mud engulfing his feet. His body was completely covered in the muck, and the fog still lingered towards him. The surroundings of the marshland hadn't changed, and he'd been running for so long in so many directions, there was no way to tell which way he was even facing now. This was unknown territory, and the fog was different here, somehow. It was a pale green, drawn to his body, creating a thicker cloud in the small radius. Maybe it was causing hallucinations. "Hello!" he screamed, desperately hoping for a return as his voice echoed off the trees. These new flashes of light came and went, and the further he went into the fog, the longer they had lasted. He wasn't even sure if it was his own imagination or false. The man had known his name. He was here, alone, in the marshland, miles away from anyone, and yet the voice seemed so close. The flash came again. Unlike before, the light remained, and Hal's focus was instantly lost. 45 years of age, former Air Force pilot. He's unconscious at the moment. The voice was so close now. He felt as if he were asleep, and he could hear the man standing next to him, but his mind refused to wake. This was real. Hal could feel the warm blood from the cuts on his arm and his chest and the bruises on his bare feet. His arms were outstretched, desperately searching for any nearby surroundings and balance. But with each swing, he found himself spinning more and more out of balance. There was nothing to catch himself, nothing to hold on to. His breath slowed, and the blinding light slowly began fading to black. "Hold him! Hold! Mr. Brent, you need to calm down. We're losing him!" The voice faded out, and his vision went from a blinding white to a silent black. There was a deep calm and release as the pain of his wounds disappeared, and the pulsing in his ears finally quieted. And that is the pre-chapter, the prelude. In the next couple of days, I will read chapter 1. So if you're interested, please stay tuned.